So without any further ado, it's a pleasure to introduce the first speaker of today, Dr. Fârès Gillon. Dr. Fârès Gillon is a research associate in the She Studies Unit at the Department of Academic Research and Publications here at the Institute of Ismaili Studies. Dr. Gillon has obtained his PhD in Arabic and Islamic Studies at Paris, L'École Pratique des Hautes Études in 2017. And he has published several articles and several academic journals, and is currently working on producing an annotated translation of the Kitab al-Kashf, a collection of treatises transmitted by the Ismaili tradition and attributed to Ja'far ibn Mansur al-Yaman. Please, Fârès, when you're ready. Please.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Dagi. It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to present during this stimulating conference. So let me just share my screen. Thank you. So the past decades have witnessed a tremendous growth of scholarly publications in a somehow neglected field of Islamic studies, that is Ismailism. In spite of this, the great progress that has been accomplished, several questions remain in order to fully elucidate the history and intellectual history of early Ismailism. So among the problems that early Ismailism presents us with is the actual definition of the term Ismailism. In addition to the fact that the so-called Ismailis did not label themselves this way until a relatively late stage of their history, the variety of groups labeled as Ismailis in the pre-Fatimid and early Fatimid periods and the relative variety of their doctrines make it difficult to strictly define the limits of Ismailism. There are indeed some reason to question the relationship between what Heinz Halm labeled the Persian school of Ismailism on the one hand and Fatimid Ismailism on the other hand. Indeed, the respective works of these two trends present some important differences in spite of a series of common features that I will mention in a minute. For matters of convenience, I will distinguish between these two trends by using the expression Western and Eastern dawas. So a quick look at the Eastern Ismaili works on the one hand and the early Fatimid works on the other hand will easily prove that they are of different nature, the former being clearly influenced by Greek philosophy, while the latter contain no references to such literature. As a matter of fact, the Fatimids do not seem to have incorporated any doctrines of philosophical nature to their official theology before the reign of Al-Mu'izz or Al-Aziz, although recent scholarship has shown that philosophy was not totally unknown to the Western dawa. Philosophical concepts were certainly not absent from the Maghreb at the time of the early Fatimid Caliphate, but they do not seem to have immediately been part of the Ismaili doctrine, the Fatimid Ismaili doctrine. It seems that they were only progressively incorporated. Of course, there are some clear similarities between the texts of both dawas, and the fact that these are all subsumed under the name Ismailism is certainly not arbitrary. The difference between these two groups of works is not such that one is led to abandon the notion of Ismailism altogether. I would not want to give the impression that I'm underestimating the importance of common features between Eastern and Western dawas. However, the differences are enough to question the contours of Ismailism and the nature of the relationship between Eastern and Western dawas. So to address the matter of the connection between these two dawas, we would need a comprehensive comparison between the two sets of works. The comparison of taʻwīl in this regard is key, since it is an essential link between them, unlike the philosophical speculations. So how close is the Fatimid taʻwīl to the Persian taʻwīl? Of course, a comprehensive comparative study between the works of the Persians and those of Ja'far ibn Mansur al-Yaman was impeded by the lack of proper critical editions for both. Much progress has recently been made concerning Al-Sijistānī, whose main works, the Kitab al-Iftikhar, the Maqalid al-Manakutiyya, and the Ithbat al-Nubuwat are now available in high quality editions. On the other hand, there is still much to be done on the literature transmitted under the name of Ja'far ibn Mansur al-Yaman. Critical editions of his works will allow a full evaluation of this literature in order to determine whether they are indeed the work of a single author, or if, as one can suspect, they must be dated from different periods, yet all within the Fatimid period, and therefore attributed to different authors. Some, as Heinz Halm has shown with regard to the Fatarat wal-Qiranat al-Ashar, seem to contain several layers dating from different periods, which makes the attribution even more complicated. So among the common features are, of course, the general features of Shi'ism, that is the distinction between the Zahir and Batin, the Shi'i historiography of the succession of Muhammad, the role of the Imam, the notion that Ali is a wasi or asas in the terminology of Sijistānī, which, by the way, was not is not present in the early Fatimid works, the term asas. Cosmology is another example of common feature. This pentalist cosmology that we find in Sijistānī's works, so the aql, intellect, nafs, the soul, jad, fath, khayal. So these real entities are present in the Sara'ir wa Asrar al-Nutaqa and the Ta'wil al-Zakat by Ja'far ibn Mansur al-Yaman, but not in early Ismaili works such as the Kitab al-Rushd wal-Hidayah. Neither are they found in the Kitab al-Kashf, the Shawahid al-Bayan, or the Rida' fil Batin. So the hierarchy of the dawa, of course, is a common feature, as well as messianism and taʻwīl. So there are common aspects in the taʻwīl of Islamic rituals. For example, when fasting is identified with silence or concealment. However, a thorough comparison of Al-Sijistānī and Ja'far ibn Mansur al-Yaman's respective ta'wils of Islamic religious prescriptions is still needed. Regarding the ta'wil of natural elements, Hollenberg, in his recent book, Beyond the Quran, has established a useful list of symbols with reference to various Ismaili works, particularly those attributed to Ja'far ibn Mansur al-Yaman, while also occasionally referring to works of the Eastern Dawa, such as the Kitab al-Islah, as well as the Kitab al-Iftikhar, the Maqalid, and the Yanabi' by Al-Sijistānī. However, the focus of his book was not on the Eastern Dawa, and therefore does not engage in a comparative approach, although it provides some useful material to engage in such an approach. Also, Hollenberg has focused on Dawa symbols rather than Dawa Quran, so to speak, as illustrated by the fact that his book does not contain a Quranic index. Of course, given that several symbols are common to the two traditions, one can expect that there may be an overlap between ta'wil in general and Quranic ta'wil in particular. For example, in as much as sky and earth as respectively represent the Natiq and the Wasi, it will come as no surprise that verses mentioning these two elements, or even one of them, will be similarly interpreted in the Western as in the Eastern Dawa. But the aim of this presentation is to find specific verses that have the same interpretation in both traditions of Ismailism. So is there a common ta'wil, a common Quranic ta'wil between Eastern and Western Dawa? And if so, to what extent? Is there an Ismaili corpus of verses that are particularly favored by the Ismaili exegetes? So this paper can be considered as an experiment and is in any case a work in progress. If we follow the track of Quranic ta'wil, where does that lead us with regard to the relation between Al-Sijistānī and Ja'far ibn Mansur al-Yaman's respective works? What conclusions and what results can we reach when using this method? Also, the method of comparing two sets of works by tracking Quranic interpretations provides a point of entry, so to speak, in comparing these works and their doctrines. So this method eventually has wider implications than simply allowing us to identify a corpus of verses. For now, however, the objective is to identify a common exegetical tradition as opposed to a common symbolism, and to identify a set of Quranic interpretation that can be identified as Ismaili Quranic taʻwīl, as opposed to Shi'i taʻwīl in general, or to one particular author's taʻwīl. So the present paper is just a preliminary account of some of the results I have reached. It is merely the first step of a longer research, and it certainly does not claim exhaustivity. So since I'm searching for an Ismaili taʻwīl of the Quran, so chapter 12 of Al-Sijistānī, Kitab al-Iftikhar, seemed like the natural place to start. This chapter was indeed used and summarized by Ismail Punawala in his seminal article on Ismaili taʻwīl of the Quran. So I will therefore build on this and add some data to what Punawala had reported. So in this article, Punawala attempts to outline some characteristic and salient features of Ismaili taʻwīl of the Quran, and he relies mainly on three authors, that is, who are Sijistānī, Ja'far ibn Mansur al-Yaman, and Al-Qadi al-Nu'man. Punawala offers several points of comparison between Al-Sijistānī's works on the one hand and the other two authors on the other hand, yet he also notes on several occasions different interpretations from one author to another. In the last section of his article, he summarizes the chapter 12 of the Iftikhar, which is dedicated to taʻwīl. In this chapter, Sijistānī begins by stating general principles of taʻwīl. The Quranic terms designated corporal realities should actually be referred to their spiritual form. Therefore, whenever the literal meaning of these terms does not make sense, they should be referred to an inner meaning. This is how the necessity of taʻwīl is established, based on a rather rational, if not rationalistic, argumentation. Sijistānī then proceeds to a set of examples, examining the meaning of four natural realities that appear in Quranic verses and how they should be interpreted. So earth, sky, mountains, and trees. So I have not found parallels in other Ismaili sources for all the verses that he quotes, but here are some that I found interesting. So first we have in the paragraph dedicated to earth, Sijistānī quotes the verse 57:8. So, and the earth, and we stretched it forth and cast it on firm mountains, and we caused to grow every lovely pear thereon, for an insight and reminder to every penitent severed. So the first example of verses, sorry, I have not found a direct connection to Al-Sijistānī's interpretation of these verses, but the kashf attributed to Ja'far ibn Mansur al-Yaman contain an interpretation of the second of these two verses, which does not seem unrelated to Al-Sijistānī. Indeed, Ja'far ibn Mansur al-Yaman says that the penitent heart is the one who turns to God by following the truth, and its master, who was appointed by the messenger, that is the legatee, Ali ibn Abi Talib. So the connection is not direct, but we find the same idea of an appointment of the foundation or asas or the legatee, wasi. So this might just be a coincidence, but it is possible that the kashf is actually hinting here to the interpretation provided by Al-Sijistānī. Also note the equivalence between the rawasi, that is the mountains given by Sijistānī, and the religious dignitaries or emissaries of the legatee. So we will come back to this symbolism of the mountains. Then Sijistānī goes on with the symbol of the sky and stating that the term sama, sky or heaven, indicates the sky of religion, which is the messenger. So Punawala provides here references to the Shawahid wal Bayan by Ja'far ibn Mansur al-Yaman. Indeed, in this text, the sky is identified with the messenger and the earth with his legatee, al-sama misl al-natiq, wal-ard misl al-wasi. Yet, it does not provide this equivalence in reference to a particular verse. So the section on heaven in Al-Sijistānī's book begins with the example of Quran 13:17. We send down water from the sky and valleys flown according to their measure, etc. And Sijistānī says that it means that he sent down a Quran from the heart of the speaking prophet. So he identifies the sky with the speaking prophet, al-Natiq, and it was received by men. So valleys are men, and the earth at the end of the verse, فَيَمْكُثُ فِي الْأَرْضِ, man abides by, what prophet man abides in the earth. So earth is the foundation asas. So the Kitab al-Rushd wal-Hidayah contains an interpretation of the beginning of this verse up to according to their measure, as a demonstration that the term wadi appears, which appears in Quran 89:12, is a common code for imam. So it says the words he sent down from the sky mean that he sent down from the messenger and facilitated on his tongue an esoteric knowledge. So, so the sky is similarly identified with the messenger, but and the water is the esoteric knowledge, but the valleys are not men; they are the imams of the esoteric doctrine, Imat al-Batin. As we can see, the interpretation is slightly different in each. Just to say that actually Sijistānī's interpretation is closer to the one found in Tafsir al-Qummi, that is, which is a pre-Buyid Shi'i tafsir. But I will just go to the next point. So let me go directly to the mountains. So in the next pages, Al-Sijistānī quotes and interprets several verses mentioning mountains, yet it is only the first interpretation of the term that has parallels in other Ismaili texts, while the two others receive interpretation of very different nature. At the end of this paragraph, Sijistānī concludes that if the meaning of the term mountain in the Quran appears ambiguous, then taʻwīl is required. So Punawala had already noted the similarity of the interpretation of Quran 21:79 by Al-Sijistānī and by Al-Qadi Nu'man in his Asas al-Taʻwīl. Both identify the mountains with the Hujaj or Lawahiq, and both quote verse 34:10, which also refers to David and the mountains and the birds. Yet the interpretation is different because Al-Sijistānī does not provide an interpretation of the birds, even though it is an important Ismaili symbol. However, the important point here is the notion that mountains are proofs, which seems to be a specifically Ismaili code, since it is also found in early Ismaili sources such as the Kitab al-Rushd wal-Hidayah as well as the Kitab al-Kashf. So the most important, interesting interpretation here is the last one. Because it concerns yet another verse mentioning David, the mountains and the birds. So the Kashf interpretation here is very close to the one found in Al-Qadi Nu'man's text, much closer indeed than between Al-Qadi Nu'man and Al-Sijistānī. Back to the interpretation. So in this same part, the interpretation of verse 7:153, which narrates the episode where Moses asks to see God, Al-Sijistānī begins by showing the absurdity of the literal meaning of this verse. What could be the feeling of a dead thing like the mountain when its creator reveals himself onto it, if we are to understand the mountain in a literal sense? So therefore, what happens here is that Moses thinks he can perceive God as an essence without resorting to negative theology. And then when he falls down swooning, it means that he realizes that he can't. In another of his works, the Isbat al-Nubuwat, Al-Sijistānī provides what seemed to be a totally different interpretation of this verse, where he says that it means that Moses asked God to lift the intermediary between them, conjecturing that his ranks allowed him to do so. Sorry. So this shows that taʻwīl can be adapted depending on the context and argument. Yet both this interpretation have a strong philosophical tone. The apophatic theology on the one hand and the insistence of the necessity of ontological mediations are both important notions in Neoplatonic thought. Of course, they are here adapted to Islamic contexts, but in both cases, they illustrate that Al-Sijistānī's originality rather than something that we could identify as dawa doctrine, except maybe for the allusion in the Isbat al-Nubuwat to Moses' conjecture that lifting the intermediary would be more adapted to his rank. أرفع لمرتبته وأعظم لمنزلته. So this dawa doctrine appears in another interpretation of this verse, one that we find in Ja'far ibn Mansur al-Yaman's taʻwīl al-Zakat. So in the context of a discussion of the ranks and hierarchy of the dawa, the author wishes to stress that each member should strictly confine to his rank of knowledge and not overreach to a degree of knowledge that he is not entitled to. So this episode becomes an illustration of the necessity to obey the higher ranks to understand one's own martaba, one's own degree in the spiritual and ontological hierarchies, which is a common theme in Ismaili thought. So there are two things we can deduce from this. First, the flexibility of Al-Sijistānī's taʻwīl, using quite freely the same episode to demonstrate two different points. And second, the fact that the taʻwīl al-Zakat seem to be closer to dawa themes that we also find in the Sara'ir by the same author. So that is the hierarchy of the hudud in both terrestrial and ontological senses. So just one last point very quickly. The Al-Sijistānī ends this review of Quranic natural elements with the example of the trees, and he says that the trees refer to men either righteous or debauched. يكون تأويل الأشجار إما رجال أبرار وإما رجال فجار. So Sijistānī does not give precise example as to whom these men might be, except for one, as he identifies the accursed tree with Yazid. But elsewhere in the same work, he identifies it with the Umayyads, and as noted by the Punawara, Shawahid provides the same identification. This general rule about Quranic trees is illustrated by several other examples in Ismaili literature, among them Qadi Nu'man, Naisaburi, as well as in the Kitab al-Kashf. But as it turns out, in what Bar Asher has labeled the pre-Buwahid school of exegesis, both the cursed tree and the corrupt tree are commonly identified with the Banu Umayyah, as opposed to the good tree. So we can find this, for example, in the Tafsir al-Qummi and Tafsir al-Ayashi. So this exegetical tradition has flourished, which has flourished in various branches of Ismailism, is actually rooted in common ground, that is the pre-Buwahid school of exegesis. So as previously stated, common symbols naturally lead to common interpretations, yet there are traces of a common corpus of verses, i.e. a common exegetical tradition. Of course, it would require further research to determine the contents of this corpus. So it seems that Al-Sijistānī Quranic taʻwīl can be divided into three main types. The one that resorts to the pre-Buwahid school of exegesis, according to the terminology of Bar Asher. Second, the Ismaili taʻwīl, or what I would call dawa Quranic taʻwīl, that is Quranic taʻwīl focusing on the hierarchy of the dawa, as well as initiatory and messianic themes. And however, and this is the third type of Quranic taʻwīl found in Al-Sijistānī's work, there are several cases where Al-Sijistānī departs from the dawa Quranic taʻwīl. Among the possible reasons for this, in spite of the evident similarities, well, is the fact that Al-Kitab al-Iftikhar is not exactly a dawa work in the sense that it's not aimed for internal use, but for external use, that is for non-Ismailis. Therefore, the aim, it's a polemical work. Therefore, the aim of his chapter on taʻwīl is not so much to provide the actual full taʻwīl of the Quranic verses that he quotes, but rather to illustrate a general theory of taʻwīl and to justify taʻwīl in itself. The original approach of Al-Sijistānī may also simply be the result of his independence as a thinker, and this is what makes his work so stimulating. That is not only his close knowledge and wide roots of Greek philosophy, but also his quite personal approach of Shi'i and Ismaili themes and doctrines. This independence may explain why the parallels I found between Al-Sijistānī's taʻwīl and Ja'far ibn Mansur al-Yaman's were mostly indirect, as if the Ismaili taʻwīl was in the background of Al-Sijistānī thought, but that his works, while relying on his taʻwīl, did not belong to this kind of literature. Thank you for your attention.